Welcome to Metal Matters, a Gimme Radio podcast. I'm your host, Mike Hill, and I'll be leading you on this adventure. We'll be getting into deep discussions about classic records, profiles on up-and-coming bands, and interviews with your favorite artists. You can check out new episodes every week, so be sure to subscribe and never miss out. Hey guys, thanks for tuning in. For this episode of Classic Records, I teamed up with New York hardcore scribe and former music industry exec Howie Abrams. What started out as a discussion about Scratch the Surface, Sick of It All's legendary record, quickly expanded into a recollection of the band's formation in the early days of New York hardcore. Before we get started, if any of you guys want to hit me up, my main social media is Instagram and Facebook. Follow me at Alleged Mike Hill on Instagram, where I post about the show as well as a bunch of personal stuff. On Facebook, I'm Michael Hill. There's a bunch of thousands of guys named Mike Hill out there, so, pay attention. DM me on either platform. If you want to hit me up about the show, let me know what you like or don't like. And even if you have any recommendations or suggestions of stuff you might want to hear. Also, if you're a Gimme Radio listener, check out my DJ show, The Sacred of Profanity. It's a 2-hour show, comes out twice a month. I play everything from Susie and the Banshees to Morbid Angel to Agnostic Front. I don't know if you remember, but a few years ago, I spoke with you briefly. I did a piece about Sick of It All.
It was like a three-parter.
Yeah, it's a three-part, like sort of oral history kind of thing about the band. And, now we're going to focus mostly on Scratch the Surface as a classic record. Yep. Even though, that's like the major label record.
Yeah.
But in a lot of ways, I feel like that record put Sick of It All and New York hardcore, maybe hardcore in general, on the map in like a global kind of way.
Well, it definitely did an awful lot for them because, you take for granted like how strong the distribution is for those labels, right? So the record definitely gets out there, more so than a lot of other means can offer, I mean, I thought we did a pretty good job with In Effect too. And, we had the largest independent distribution network that we were, connected to, but, being through the WIA system is a different animal.
Right.
And I think, whether the people who'd heard of them finally caught up or and a combination of that and a lot of new people, hearing about and able to purchase a record from the band. It was definitely a big period for them for sure.
Before we get started on that, I just want to get a little bit about your background because you've been a pretty big player in the sort of, label management industry side of things here in New York and in your connection with New York City hardcore as well. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, you started out, my awareness of you started with In Effect Records. Mm-hmm. Okay, so are you from Queens? You're from Queens originally?
Originally from Queens, born and raised there, and then, got into the music like kind of everybody else, and then, you get on a quest for faster music, which is really kind of, the underground period that I was really a part of. It was like this quest to find the fastest band,
Right.
Whether it was metal, whether it was punk, whether it was hardcore, it didn't matter. It was just like, Metallica would come out with Kill 'Em All, and then Slayer would come out and be like, they're faster, and then you'd hear DRI and be like, they're faster. And then, you'd find like crazy bands like Siege and Larm and, stuff like that. It'd be like, Jesus Christ, what, this is the stuff that your parents like start to say, this isn't even music,
Oh yeah, definitely.
And, so I was just really, deeply into music. And then I did a fanzine when I was in, probably I guess it was about the beginning of high school, with a good friend of mine, and we started to meet a lot of the bands. So we were going to the shows and CB's matinees and all that kind of stuff anyway, but you actually were kind of networking, and you didn't necessarily realize it, but that's what was happening.
At that young age, you just see the same faces over and over again.
Right, and then somebody needs, help carrying gear into the matinee, and they put you on the list, and, suddenly you're friends with Vinny Stigma. It's like, it's that kind of stuff. And, so I was really, really into the music. And I think one of the important things for me was the stuff that I didn't like. I was very passionate about the stuff that I really freaking hated. And there were bands that were popular where I'm like, why the fuck do people like this band?
You want to name some names?
It's not even worth naming names. It was just kind of like, some bands were just sort of getting too much credit. I can't even remember which bands it was, but there were bands that I just felt were getting sort of a lot of attention at the time. And I was sort of shocked by how much attention they were getting, And sometimes it was just from magazines and things, and they didn't even have a ton of fans. And it was like, why are you paying so much attention to them? Like, there's a band kind of right here under your nose that's blows that band away and draws more people and, is saying more with their lyrics or this, that, and the other thing. And you're not showing them any love. I don't get it, And so that, being that kind of opinionated kid was like a big deal. And I think that's what led to ultimately wanting to have a label, because really, again, there were all these bands, and hardcore specifically, that were just not getting any attention that I thought really deserved it. And, when we started, in effect, a large part of it was to help sort of rescue Agnostic Front from Combat Records. They were on a metal label. And sure, there were people who, to a degree, gave a shit about them, but ultimately didn't give a shit about them as much as the death metal bands that they were more passionate about and liked. And we were like, this band does so much better than these bands, and you're giving these death metal bands tour support, and you're, glossy ads and Rip and all those silly magazines, and like, why aren't you paying attention to a band like this?
Yeah, it seems like there has always been, from day one, the illusion that, metal sold more than hardcore and punk, or that, it was like, T-shirts are more expensive, shows are more expensive. There was this like illusion to that, but
there was like an organized industry around that stuff, for better or worse. And so the illusion came a little bit from that, like, so that there were, publicists for these bands, and there were, all kinds of stuff. Again, the visual was out there, again, whether it was glossy ads and big metal magazines or whatever it was, there was this perception that, metal was just this big deal. And of course, there was very commercial metal on MTV, and, people would just say metal and not really understand the difference between, like, there's a Morbid Angel and there's a Motley Crue,
Yeah, definitely.
And so that kind of stuff would happen. But then you had these hardcore bands, and, by 84, 85, you have this crossover thing happening, and that was a really pivotal moment for metal and hardcore. And, that started to change because those bands started to play together, and there were more shows and tours and things like that where, the lines were kind of blurred. And, you started to care a little bit less, like if they were a long-haired metal band from San Francisco, or if they were, skinheads from New York, who played like more of a New York hardcore thing.
Yeah, that was like a real interesting point because, I was in high school in like the mid 80s, 15, 16 years old. And I was way into metal and hard rock when I was a kid, 13, Judas Priest, Dio era, Sabbath, that kind of stuff.
Awesome.
Great stuff. And then I started getting into Black Flag. I remember a friend of ours went to California one year, and he was a metalhead. Then he came back after the summer with that Let Them Eat Jelly Beans compilation.
Right.
And everyone became punks after that.
Right.
Like, he got rid of his long hair and a short new wave haircut and everything. Ramone's painting on the back of his jacket, And then I was a punk, even though I still really like, Black Sabbath and all this stuff. But then when I saw Metallica wearing like GBH t-shirts and Misfits shirts, I was like, this is like an interesting thing.
Well, that was a big deal that people don't give a lot of credit to, is those bands. And they were wearing them, let's say, like from mid 83 on, you would see James Hetfield with a GBH or a Discharge shirt or whatever.
Right.
And Kirk would wear a Discharge shirt on stage a lot. And it's interesting because I find that a lot of the New York kids got into that British punk hardcore stuff even more than the West Coast stuff. So they were into, the GBH and the Exploited, Discharge, the Verruchers, things like that, even more so than like the Circle Jerks and Black Flag. Like, to this day, I'm still not, and I respect the shit out of them, but I've never been a big Black Flag, Dead Kennedys, guy. Like the West Coast sound, it wasn't heavy, which was a big difference coming from like having been a metal kid and like, sort of like Priest, but then loved Iron Maiden. When I feel like Iron Maiden took their crown.
Well, especially Paul Di'Anno era of Iron Maiden.
They deny it, but to me, there's punk in that.
I read
in that era.
Too. And it has to be.
Steve Harris hates fucking punk.
Yeah,
like hates it. He's like, we did this band to like destroy punk, and I'm like, I don't know about that, but like, okay, I understand. Maybe if I was in England at the time, I'd get it more, but. I got really into those bands who were big more so than like the Dead. I was very into the Misfits, I will say that.
Yeah.
But the Dead Kennedys and like Jello's voice annoyed the shit out of me. To me, the music was kind of thin and like a little like goofy,
A little bit, yeah. The lyrics and the sort of like surfy guitar stuff.
Yeah, and it's like I understood the merits of it, but I never found myself wanting to listen to it. I would I'll put on, Hear Nothing, See Nothing, Say Nothing any day. I'll put on City Baby Attacked by Rats right now, but I never really gravitated towards that stuff. Suicidal was probably the one, West Coast band early that I really did like. That first album is just, untouchable for me.
Definitely.
And then later on, I liked, some of the other Venice stuff. Like I liked Excel a lot, and like Beowulf and No Mercy. I liked that,
Mike Muir sound. He was in No Mercy too, right?
He sang some songs with them, or he filled in. It was a very incestuous like Venice, scene there for a while. But that Welcome to Venice comp like put a lot of that sound on the map, and you got to hear those bands. And I liked that scene more than a lot of the sort of, Hollywood or, out in the burbs, Cali stuff.
Descendants sort of.
Yeah, and I actually liked the poppy punk stuff more,
really?
Okay. Like, because I thought that was their sound. So the Descendants, I'm not a huge Bad Religion guy, but I like them, Pennywise to me is just like, Bad Religion B, it's kind of, why do I need to hear Pennywise? Although I do think they're good, but I don't crave listening to them. I never said, oh my God, I really want to listen to Pennywise.
I always really dug TSOL.
I like TSOL too because they were different.
Yeah, they were different, and
they were almost a little gothy.
Yeah,
and,
definitely.
Wash Away and that kind of stuff. Like that was really good, I thought.
I mean, I heard the Misfits before I heard TSOL.
Me too.
So I was thinking, oh, these guys are like kind of referencing that same dark, like horror kind of vibe.
But the Misfits had that East Coast feel. It was raw and it had more of a rough edge to it, where TSOL was almost polished, you know?
Yeah, true.
And so I didn't like the polished stuff, And again, it came from that that search for faster and more raw, even though I liked a lot of bands that weren't particularly fast and like a TSOL, but that raw, and there was something about, again, coming from the metal side, the heaviness, that these bands were actually heavy bands. And, the guitar tones and the bass tones and the way the drummer played, like all that stuff mattered to me, And I think as a metal fan, you care about production a little bit more and those types of things. And that's just the stuff that I was really into.
Yeah, actually, I'm a little embarrassed to say this, but the first AF record I heard was Cause for Alarm record.
Right. A lot of people.
Yeah. And then I went back, to the older material. But once when I remember the same day I heard Cro-Mag's Age of Quarrel, Cause for Alarm, and Motorhead, No Remorse.
It's a good day.
We were all hanging out in my buddy's room and we were playing these records. And then I looked at the record cover for Age of Quarrel. For
Victim of Pain.
Cause for Alarm.
Cause for Alarm, yeah.
And I was like, these guys look like, like long hair and everything. And then the deeper I got into the music, the more I discovered that, well, this is actually, it's hardcore music.
They changed.
A different sort of thing. And but yeah, that connection to metal and hardcore and punk all sort of felt very much at home in New York City. So
it did. And it was interesting because, to segue a little bit to Sick of It All, it's like, I feel like we grew up very similarly when it comes to music, We went from that, you get introduced to the sort of Sabbaths and the Deep Purples and the Rainbows and that kind of stuff. And then, you hear Judas Priest and then Maiden, and you dig deeper into the new wave of British heavy metal, and you're reading Kerrang and, all that kind of stuff. And then, you hear Motorhead, and after Motorhead, you're like, I need this, I need more of this. And then so, there were a handful of metal bands at that time, like when Motorhead was still kind of in the early days before the thrash metal thing really started to kick off. Basically you had them, and then you would hear like a Discharge or a GBH, and then you'd hear the Misfits. So around that time, and then, you start to realize that there's this scene going on in New York, right under your nose, and there's an Agnostic Front, and there's a Murphy's Law, and a little later the Cro-Mags, like a couple of years later, but you had bands like Cause for Alarm, and you had bands like the Mob, and you had Reagan Youth, and these were the bands that really formed the sound of New York, like that New York hardcore sound that people talk about,
right?
Like it was those bands, and I always refer to AF, Murphy's Law, Cro-Mags. That's the big three of New York hardcore, because when I first started coming to shows, again, the Cro-Mags hadn't really started yet. They were about a year or two in the making before recording anyway.
Yeah.
Those were the bands. Like, those were the bands everyone would come to see. Those were the bands everybody wanted to dress like. Those were the bands like that established the attitude of the scene in New York. And so again, to go to Sick of It All, they grew up in the same, direction, so they heard those same bands. They came from that same new wave of British heavy metal, Motorhead, holy shit, having heard Black Sabbath already, of course. And then looking for that, like, the darker, harder, faster stuff. And then, some of us went over the edge with that shit, like just, like really fast and like just indecipherable almost.
Like Danny Lilker. Yeah.
Right. And like, it was like a great friend of mine, and he turned me on to so many bands.
Yeah, Danny was actually one of my guests, like, I think episode 3 or 4 or something like that. Yeah.
And so, he and I, like starting probably about 84, 85, we were hanging out a lot, and we would just demos, and we would just go to one of the other person's house and just listen to demos, and like, holy shit, this is faster than this, and this is heavier than this. And, it was almost like a game, where it was like, did you hear the blah, blah, blah demo? And it's like, it's faster than Siege, or it's more, it's more this than Larm, or, or any of the, like, the Neos, or any of these really fast bands. And, and then, I'd meet Pete and Lou later and find out, like, same exact music. Like, they like the same stuff. We'd be at the same shows, before we knew each other. And then later, when we knew each other, we were excited about going to the same shows.
It's funny how that works out sometimes, where you can meet someone for the first time, and then you see that they're into like almost the same exact bands and types of things. It almost makes me think that we're in like this like video game where everyone's like given these attributes, and then suddenly they meet each other.
It's so true. And I told them, I was like, I don't know if you're going to remember this, but I was like, I used to see you guys on the subway, going to shows, like when they all had long hair, like Armand had hair like down to his waist with like a Venom patch on the back of his jacket, and we took the same train, whether it was to go to a Ritz show or go to a CB's matinee or an Irving Plaza show, or whatever it was. Thankfully, I didn't, I always had a ride to Lemoore. I only took the train there once, because
that could be a rough ride out there.
It's a rougher ride home. So basically, I was like, yeah, I used to see you guys. Like, you'd be like in a pack of like 6, 7 people, and it would be basically, Pete, Lou, Armand, Craig, Rob from Rest in Pieces. There was this girl named May that was always with them. Couple other people, give or take, and every once in a while I'd see them on the train. They're like, how come you never came and said anything to us? I was like, well, I was by myself because I was meeting people at the show, and it just seemed weird, so I didn't say anything to you, but I saw you all the time on the train. I was like, I know where they're going, Yeah,
it's pretty, especially back then.
Yeah, and then later on we would be like, hey, did you go to that show? I was like, yeah, I saw you on the subway on the way to that show. So it was, it was that kind of upbringing, and then finding out like whether it was at the same time or whatever, that there were people doing exactly the same thing you were doing around the same bands, buying the same records, going to the same shows, buying the same T-shirt at Bleecker Bob's,
Yeah. So starting the record label, like how did, you and Steve Martin started that? Is that correct?
So Steve came in a couple of minutes after I did. I was my first proper job in the music business was a salesperson for what was called Important Records at the time, which is now Red, which is actually sort of now the Orchard. And they were the biggest independent distribution for records in the country. And they were based in Hollis, Queens. I was in Queens Village, so like barely 10 minutes away. And actually, it was Danny Loker and the guys in Nuclear Assault who introduced me to the people who were running that place. And I wound up getting a job there as a salesman when I was 18 years old. And again, it was great. I lived 10 minutes away. I was like going to sell records. I was like, this is amazing. So, I was there for a while. I wasn't the best salesman in the world, but it was a great foot in the door. And I learned a ton by being a salesperson there. And again, what I was talking about earlier about the like, how come, these bands are getting more attention than these bands, that kind of thing. I started to notice that Combat was pushing like bands that I was aware of, like just from the underground. And I'm like, why are you paying attention to that shit? Nobody's going to buy that, things like that. And then, again, started to realize that AF was kind of getting the shit end of the stick. And then I realized that also these other bands were starting to like come up and become a factor. And I thought that they could be, popular bands and do well with this crossover audience that was now out there, especially. So I started to talk to the head of purchasing. His name is Alan Becker. He's actually still at the company.
Oh, really?
A billion years later. Really good guy.
Job security.
Big time. And great guy. And I started like bitching and whining to him about like what I was seeing, And, as the bitching and whining continued, it sort of became why don't we start like another imprint over there and like do something else and like really cater to this, whether it be hardcore or just the bands that don't fit in that we think are great or whatever. And you can't just put like a metal label on them or whatever. And so, it was a well-received idea. And so we decided that we were going to start a label and kind of focus on hardcore, and that we would launch the label with Agnostic Front. So we would take them off of Combat and we would put them on what became In Effect Records. And, ultimately, the record, the Live at CBGB's record, which was the first one we did with them, was kind of already a plan. That was already something they were going to do. So we're like, what a great way to launch the label with something like that. But at the same time, we're like, well, we need to prove that we're serious. Like, so it can't just be one record. And then 8 years later, we come out with another, some other thing, So we realized that, Important was distributing Roar. And we reached out to Roar, and because hardcore had started to become big enough where you could put music out on CDs. Can you imagine that? Like, it was only just getting to that point. It's like 87-ish,
Right.
And, we're like, let's talk to Roar and see if we could do the Bad Brains Roar cassette on CD for the first time. So we got that deal done.
Now, I just want to stop for 1 second
Yeah.
here, and I want to underscore the importance of the Bad Brains to New York hardcore.
Oh, Jesus. They created New York hardcore without even knowing it.
Yeah.
The reason that all the New York bands became bands is because the Bad Brains moved to New York, and they all saw them and were like, Jesus Christ, like everything just changed, and they were, sort of the sound of it without knowing that that's what they were going to create, that they were going to create this whole new scene in New York, taking a little bit of what they brought with them from DC, obviously, but they were such a unique band, anyway, mixing up reggae and punk and very sped up
jazz
punk.
chops.
Right. And they could just play
Yeah.
because they came from being, like jazz fusion guys.
Incredible players.
And then you have this guy, HR, fronting the thing, who's the greatest, front man of all time. And, and so when they moved to New York and they would play like an A7 or, like the 171A or whatever, like the people that saw them were the Cro-Mags and Murphy's Law, whether those bands existed yet or not, and AF. And they were all just like, Jesus, we have to start bands, And so then the New York guys really threw the New York juice on it, and really made it sound like New York.
Because at the time the Bad Brains were playing in New York City, it was pre-hardcore, and it was more still like sort of in like a punk vibe, right?
Yeah. When it first started. That was
yeah.
the sort of 79, 80.
Yeah.
But then a little bit later, certainly by 81, they were a friggin' hardcore band. Like they were just blasting away, at a mile a minute and just killing. And they were just better than every other band. That's just a fact. And, they were untouchable. Like you should not play after them.
Right.
You're not going to survive that well, but those bands became bands because of the Bad Brains and, them leaving DC and moving here to, because there were more places to play. And, so there was now this scene and this community forming, downtown. And it was a very interesting time. So we started this label. Obviously this is a good few years later, but it was the next wave, and Agnostic Front were sort of like the second wave of hardcore, let's say, Murphy's Law, Cro-Mags, that whole thing. And then you had these bands that were starting to really make noise. Sick of It All, Raw Deal, Underdog, like that level of band, like those bands were starting to matter. And, they weren't just playing New York, they're playing the East Coast, they had demos circulating, things like that. And then, Sick of It All went and did the 7-inch with Revelation.
Right.
And so Revelation was kind of really, establishing themselves with straight edge bands mostly. A lot of people thought Sick of It All was a straight edge band because they were on Revelation.
That connection,
which, they almost were really, but, they didn't preach that and they didn't, that wasn't a part of their agenda or anything. And so, that 7-inch came out. And now a lot more people know about them, And so, you'd get let's backtrack. Don't forget they were on 2 Rev comps before their 7-inch.
Right, okay.
They were on the Together 7-inch.
Okay.
And they were on the album that came out, with the live photo from the Anthrax on it. Not the band Anthrax, but the
Connecticut
Connecticut
DIY
club.
Yep.
The second version of that club. And they were on that comp. And so they started to get something out of that and their demo. And then they put out their 7-inch. And so now people are asking about them. They're not just like forcing themselves and working themselves towards an audience.
And that's an important step in a band's sort of evolution is when, you're almost forcing yourself, telling people about your band, like politicking to get yourself on these bills. And that moment when the promoters actually ask for you. Or
that's the thing, because the record makes you tangible for whatever reason, I mean, I know why, but the record makes you tangible. And so, the Boston promoter and the Rhode Island promoter and the DC promoter, and they're all like, hey, what about this band Sick of It All? Yep. People seem to like them, And then you'd get to a place like a Boston or whatever, and now you can sell shirts,
Yeah,
and
totally.
so
Pay for gas.
people have your shirts too, and are wearing them to other people's shows, So slowly but surely, you've got a presence now in these other towns, and so now you're not just a New York, New Jersey band, between, sort of City Gardens and CBs and the once in a while Super Bowls. You can play in a whole bunch of other places and actually, create a fan base. And they did that, And so, they were the first band after our launch of In Effect that I actually signed, that I was like, we got to work with that band, They were impossible to ignore, certainly in this city. But you knew that they were a factor elsewhere now, but you also knew how fucking good they were. Like, they were just a steamroller band. And, from a lyrical point of view, they were very no frills,
Yeah, definitely.
Like, there was no, pretense to them whatsoever. There was no uniform that they wore, like a lot of other bands of that period, the straight edge uniform and the champion, sweatshirt and the Air Jordans and whatever. They just weren't those guys. They were just this pissed off band. And also they played really fast, which was something that I loved about them because, they came as a combination of like Rest in Pieces and NYC Mayhem straight ahead, and, NYC Mayhem was like New York's real thrash band,
definitely. Yep.
Like they were the band that followed in the footsteps of DRI and, that kind of stuff, the early DRI stuff. And, really like, we used to call it jerky thrash, because it was just the time changes and stuff was really crazy. And, so they had that sound, and it was a sound that I already liked from the bands that they came from. And then they started to incorporate it into their own material. And I thought they were fucking great. I mean, I saw their first show, and, you wouldn't have seen their first show and be like, wow, they're great, but you thought Pete and Lou were great, but they had a drummer who like didn't give a shit, that much about the band, and a bass player didn't give it that much of a shit about the band, and the drummer was like an Asian white power skin.
Oh, geez, yeah, I remember that from the interview with
Dave,
those guys.
So I was like, this is the weirdest thing I've ever seen, and they're always like, did his parents ever know what he was into, and but they got better fast, and they got really good quickly, and they were just this force to me. And so we brought them on to In Effect, and I'm glad that we got to work with them and put out that first album and everything. And, I think we did a good job with them. And I mean, listen, it's almost 33 years later, and they're still doing it,
Now, when they signed to In Effect Records, there was this illusion, this pretense that they were somehow getting signed to they're selling their souls to some major label company, right?
Yeah. Well, there was that debate.
Yeah.
But listen, when they signed with us, we were a completely independent company. The label itself was run by myself and a member of Agnostic Front.
Yeah.
Not corporate. So, later on, there were some people who took offense to the way that we operated and the way that the band operated, which I thought was insane. And, for the most part, it was these kids trying to justify this new scene that was going on down at ABC No Rio. And, so while I understand it to a degree, I don't feel like they made a great case on their own merits. I think they scapegoated In Effect and Sick of It All, and the points that they were making about why they had an issue with us were just stupid. And I didn't agree with it. And, obviously I was trying not to be like personally offended, by it.
Yeah, but it's hard to, at that age,
Yeah, I mean, I felt like I was
young.
a kid, and these guys are like looking in our pockets, and, they're criticizing everything we're doing. And again, we knew full well that it was to justify their own thing, which again is fine, but like you picked the wrong people, Yeah,
I mean, maybe now I think looking back, there's probably a different perspective on that. You know what I mean? It's just that, everyone's young and crazy,
I mean, one of the major issues was that, again, we're working with an independent record distributor. It's the late 80s. People in the real world don't give a shit about hardcore. Right. They don't give a shit about New York hardcore. They don't give a shit about hardcore, period. And so our goal with In Effect was we wanted as many kids as possible to hear this music, because we saw what these bands could do in one region of the country. So why shouldn't the kid in Nebraska and Iowa and Colorado, wherever, why shouldn't those kids have access to this too? And we were spoiled in New York. We had Some Records and Bleecker Bob's and like all these places that you could buy hardcore records and stuff. In these other parts of the country, that wasn't the case. There's a lot of mail order stuff going on, and, it shows up 3 months later, scratched, broken, whatever.
Or if at all, I remember.
If at all, because, they couldn't keep up with orders, and it was a different game,
Yeah.
And so we had the ability to, get our records and record chains and things like that. And a lot of these kids in other parts of the country, that's how they got these records. And so, going through the S section and whatever record chain in a mall. And so these ABC No Rio kids would like bitch about that. And it's like, you're fucking idiots. And then we had an issue because obviously there was a lot of fucks and shits on the Sick of It All album. And we were like, look, if we put this all over the lyric sheet, like nobody's going to carry this record except like indie stores. And if that's your goal, cool, but I think we all had the conversation that that's not the goal. We want anybody to get this record.
Right.
So we said, why don't we do this? You have the song Injustice System on the album. There's no cursing in it. Let's put that on the lyric sheet, as the only song on the lyric sheet. But we'll send anybody who wants the lyrics, we'll send them a lyric sheet for free. Like we'll mail it to your house, and that's our compromise, because then we'll get over on these stores. Like they won't even know that they've got an album.
Surely they're not going to listen to the record.
No, exactly. Like they're not going to know the album is fuck shit, all over the place, but they don't have to read it on the lyric sheet. A parent doesn't have to find it in their kid's bedroom, read it, and go complain, and then these records would get pulled in a second, we would have no shot. Like we weren't, CBS Records who had Michael Jackson and this, that, and the other thing. And nobody would dare pull their records, but we would get destroyed, It would be the end of everything.
You'd be a liability in their organization.
100%. 100%. Exactly. And we'd be putting them at risk,
That's right. That's correct.
And they're, they don't care. They only want what sells, and they're more than happy to double stock their shelves with major artists and have any hardcore bands in their stores, and people didn't understand that. So, because of Sick of It All's early, success and popularity, they had these kinds of problems, and they had to, be somebody who would address them, and again, like people like, well, Combat had, this, that, and the other thing, but it's like, they sold a lot in indie stores. And then again, as we said before, there was this sort of industry around metal, and somehow it made it more palatable to these retailers, which makes no sense because they're talking about, Satan and, and all that. And like, basically, Sick of It All's talking about social issues and, that kind of stuff. So, we had a lot of barriers to get around or through or over or whatever. But it was important to us. So we did it.
One of the things I look at is like, people always give Black Flag like the credit for establishing the touring routes throughout the country. And I always like to look at that Sick of It All record as like what put punk and hardcore, gave it the channel into mainstream sort of markets. You know what I mean?
Well, I think what happened was by the time that they were going to do like their first, touring, they were on more of a like traditional tour routing, in a more traditional tour routing world, right? Whereas Black Flag, those early punk and hardcore tours, like every third show is canceled. Yeah. It's in a VFW hall, so it's not like a promoter that does a lot of other shows. So everything about it's kind of sketchy. So you got to respect them big time for like surviving that stuff, and blazing the trail, But Sick of It All got to jump onto something that was kind of already working, but not for a band like them. And then they got to coattail onto something that was already kind of in motion. So, people forget, I think, that, after their headlining run, when the first album came out, the first tour they did was with Exodus, and they did an East Coast run with Exodus. And that was a very, very different thing for them, but it was a very established, like all the venues you heard about, like, and all that stuff. And, Exodus was a big band at this point, it's their third album. And, I talked to Gary Holt the other day about that tour. We were talking about it. I interviewed him for the book.
Oh, nice.
And so he recalled that tour, and he was just like, for us, we just knew that there was this thing going on in New York. Like, we didn't know tons of the bands. They said they kind of knew about Leeway,
Well, yeah, Leeway's very metal, yeah.
But they're like, we didn't realize the strength of that movement, So they're like, he's like, Sick of It All came on the road with us there, and they were just killing, And then you talk to Sick of It All, and they're like, we were killing, but we had to really win those kids over. Like, at the beginning of the show, it was sort of like, the staring at us for a couple of songs, and then, a couple of kids would start dancing or whatever, and then by the end of the show, it was going great, But they're like, we had to work really hard on those shows.
And it was probably a city-by-city grind, too. Because,
big time.
Remember...
You started all over again the next day.
Yeah, because there's no internet. There's no message boards about how this band
The
rocks.
band's in front of you, and that's it.
Yeah.
And then what would happen would be like, Gary would wear like their shirt on stage when
Exactly.
Exodus played,
Yep.
and he like would justify their existence, and
Well, that's a big statement, really, if you think about it. It's like we were talking about earlier with like James Hetfield wearing
That's
a Misfits
right.
T-shirt. It all comes full circle back
That's right.
to that kind of one-on-one.
Sepultura were wearing Sick of It All shirts.
Yeah.
You had a couple of these metal bands, that were really into them, and like Sick of It All Sepultura found out about Sick of It All while they were in Brazil. So they were fans before they really started coming over here, and but they were really big fans. They were big New York hardcore, like aficionados, like they were into AF and Sick of It All and all that stuff, like before they ever came here. And so, it started to become this one big thing. And that was the thing that Gary Holt said. He's like, we just didn't care. Like, it didn't, long hair, skinheads, it didn't matter. Like, it was about the music, and that's it, and the attitude, like that you were out here to kill an audience, and that you had something to offer and you were going for it, and that's all anybody cared about. And so Sick of It All did really well on that tour. And then you noticed that like the metal establishment started to like, Sick of It All, and then they went out and did the whole country with DRI. Which at the time, they had really crossed over and were for all intents and purposes a metal band.
Yeah, it was after that crossover.
It was the next album, I think, even
that one, yep.
Thrash Zone or whatever.
Yeah.
It's like, but whatever. But we all grew up loving DRI, so we were like, shit, we're gonna do the DRI tour, and those guys were the same, like where they were just like, we're gonna go and do the whole country with DRI. They got $50 a night on that tour.
$50 a night, and
$50.
even in 1988 or 87, that $50 is still not a lot of money.
No, $50 was $50. So that was the like, thank God we're selling merchandise.
Yeah, totally.
But then by the time they did that tour, their name was out there enough that they would show up to those shows and there'd be Sick of It All fans there. Not necessarily tons, but if there were 30 or 40 of them, let's say, it would get the crowd moving. And that 30 or 40 turned, into 300-400, by the end of the show, of people who liked them and cared and started buying merch, So that was a pivotal moment for them, because that was like the right band to go out with at the right time. And that worked, really, really well. And, then later they did that New Titans on the Block tour with Sepultura, who loved them.
Yeah.
Specifically asked for them, and Sacred Reich and Napalm Death. And they shared a bus with Napalm Death. And they're like, there was a real kinship with them because they liked the same music and they had the same kind of attitude and stuff. And they said, we were cool with everybody. They're like, we loved, those guys. But they're like, there was a riot at like every one of the shows on that tour for one reason or another.
Oh, yeah. It's,
the tour started in Allentown. How about that?
Yeah, I mean, Allentown is, at least back then, notoriously was like a stronghold of like certain white nationalist activity.
Hardly certain. It was like almost the majority.
Yeah, it was
like some of the shows were the majority.
Yeah,
and they said that show was one of them. And they're like, they're spitting at us and they're, calling us like Jew lovers and nigger lovers and stuff. And we're like, what the fuck is going on? And they're like, we had played small shows in like Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and Allentown. So we knew that this was here.
There's
and
an element there.
They're like, but it wasn't like this, like hundreds of them at one show. And they're like, and it happened at this show. And they're like, it just turned into a brawl. And so, you know, they're like, all four of us were like fighting, like stopping the show, like the whole thing. Pete's beating people with his guitar, like all this stuff. And then their road manager for Sepultura, who they said was very much a rock tour manager, was like, you guys can't do that. I don't care what anybody says about, you know, you guys or whatever. And they're just like, we're not going to take that shit, you know, like, and so he was like trying to get them thrown off the tour after one show. And then Igor and Max, they're like, are you guys okay? Like, what happened? And they're like, yeah, your tour manager wants to throw us off the tour. They're like, yeah, that's not fucking happening. Wow. You know? And so they had to be saved, you know, like the first show. You know? And then they said the last show was in the Pacific Northwest somewhere, ended with another riot.
I was going to say, you started in Allentown, and then the Pacific, especially in the late 80s, is also like
Nazi stronghold. And you know, and they all loved hardcore, you know?
Of course.
And so, you know, this angry, sick of it all comes to town, and they're like, we got to go. And they just said it was just like a nightmare, you know, because, you know, they said sometimes the trouble was after the whole show ended or whatever, but they're like, we just wanted to play the show. They're like, it was costing us money to be on the road. Like, we want to play our show.
Yeah, totally.
You know, they're like, we're far from home. Like, we got to get this set in, you know? But yeah, so they just did sort of everything right, and they were willing to take chances, and they were willing to put in that work. But most importantly is they were just friggin' crushing. You know, they got on stage and they just killed, you know, and it was every night. And they were different to a lot of these kids, you know, they hadn't seen anything like that before. That generation, you know, so maybe some of those kids had seen Agnostic Front across the country or whatever, you know, but they hadn't seen this like pure new breed hardcore band from New York just throwing down in front of them and just like, you know, being a friggin' tornado in the room, you know?
Now, after this is when they actually signed with was East West for the.
Well, they did one more record, right? Okay. So there was no more in effect after a while.
Okay.
We were around for about 5 years. And then so the second album, Just Look Around, came out on Relativity proper, which was like the parent company of the labels. Still with Important, but the parent company was Relativity because Sony bought the whole company, fired a whole bunch of the staff, myself included, and started dropping most of the bands. So I guess the timing was such that Just Look Around was either in progress or done or whatever. So they're like, we'll just put it out. But they paid no attention to it. So the company released it. It came out sort of very quietly. And, you know, they didn't get to take the next step that they should have been able to take with that album because it's a really strong album.
Yeah, definitely.
And, you know, it kind of went quietly. But then after that, they were so unhappy that they said, can you guys just drop us? Like, you don't want us. You don't treat us like you want us, so let us not be here. And they let them go. And that's when the East-West thing happened.
Now, are you privy to the information as to how they even found out about them, like A&R wise?
I don't know exactly how East-West found out about Sick of It All specifically. But if you look at that period, you know, major labels started to invest a little bit in hardcore or what they thought was hardcore, right? So you had Quicksand went over to Island, and you had Orange 9mm got signed, and Into Another got signed to Hollywood. And so Sick of It All got signed to East-West, you know? So some of the people that were like our friends or kind of grew up in the scene or, you know, were somehow attached to it, they had jobs as A&R people in these labels now, you know, and they were bringing bands like this into the label. And certainly I was skeptical, generally speaking, about that whole idea because I just thought these bands would be such small fish in these giant ponds. Like, how could it ever work?
Right.
And major labels are about radio and video play. That's what they're about. They are to this day. That's what they were about then. That's it. It's commercial, commercial, commercial. And these bands were never really going to be that commercial as much as they tried. Like Quicksand was the closest, I would say, but you know, they weren't Nirvana, you know, they came out at really kind of the same time.
Yeah. 91 was Nirvana, Nevermind. And
you know, so it was that same period, right? The grunge 90s. Thing. And, you know, so, but Sick of It All was still Sick of It All.
Yeah.
You know, and, you know, you hear Scratch the Surface, and I was really pleasantly surprised, you know, because they didn't change a bit.
No, that's one of their hardest albums, in my opinion.
I love the production. I don't know how they got Billy Anderson. Like, I don't even know why he was the producer on that album, because they did the first two with Tom Soares, and he did a really good job. And, you know, like, if you look at his resume, like, he did a lot of stoner rock bands and like things like that, Sleep and, you know, stuff like that. And I'm like, okay, like, there's got to be a reason, you know? And, you know, I wasn't thinking about it that much. It was just like, I want to hear a new Sick of It All record. I'm a fan. I want to hear the next album. And then I heard it and I was like, holy shit, this album's a banger, you know? And I loved the production.
Yeah, there's not a bad sounding song on that whole record.
No,
really.
and they sound great. The guitar tone is great. Lou sounds great. You know, Armand's great. Craig's great. I mean, it just, you know, they put out an incredible album on a major label, but I was sort of like, but what's that going to mean? You know, just, are they going to get bigger? They actually did get a little bigger. And you know, but what will this really do for them, you know? And does it matter, you know? But all I know is ultimately they just made a great album.
Yeah, but I mean, from my perspective, I feel like that record really, like, you know, they weren't, like, they were definitely a hardcore band.
Yeah.
But that's when, like, they toured with, like, Helmet, I think, or something.
Yeah, they had always taken chances with their touring.
Yeah.
But yeah, they did that kind of stuff where they did Helmet dates. I think around that time is when they did the run with the Beastie Boys, right? Yeah. When they were called Quasar for the tour. Mm-hmm. And they were in New York, I guess they were Alleyway Crew. I don't know if they played as Sick of It All or Alleyway Crew.
I don't know. I don't know.
But, you know, so they started to, you know, become visible to, like, the alternative music scene at large, let's say.
Because that was, like, a very big market in the 90s, was, like, alternative rock.
It was the first year of Lollapalooza, right? And, you know, which, you know, if you look back at it, it was pretty fucking cool. You know,
at the time,
it was
I didn't
a great
think
idea,
so, but now I think it is, actually.
You know, when you look back at, like, that bill,
yeah,
you know, of, like, Susie and the Banshees and Nine Inch Nails and Rollins and Living Colour, and, you know, like, it was a cool
Jane's Addiction,
Bill Jane's, right? And so that was the world that you were living in, and so more kids got exposed to, like, left field music, you know, and some of it was very successful. Nirvana, you know, Pearl Jam, they were on that tour too, you know, and bands of that ilk, you know, and, you know, bands, I think people thought, at least at the labels, that bands like, you know, Into Another and Quicksand and Orange 9 were, like, kind of a part of that, you know, or they wanted them to be a part of that. And Sick of It All, I think they thought something similar about them, but to me, they were the real sore thumb in that major label hardcore exploration period, because how were they going to change? They were not going to change. And you better have known that going in. Like, I don't know what you thought kind of album they were going to make, but they made a great Sick of It All album is what they made. And, I was really proud of them for that album. I thought that was such a great album. And, you know, some of my favorite songs of theirs are on that album.
Yeah, me too, actually.
You know?
What are some of your favorite tracks?
Well, I was going through, like, the track listing, and so, you know, obviously Step Down is just a freaking anthem. The title track, Scratch the Surface, is amazing. But I also like No Cure. Like, what hardcore band was addressing the AIDS crisis?
Not at that era.
You know what I mean? Nobody was doing that from lyrically. Consume.
I was going to say Consume is probably my favorite
and
track.
Maladjusted I love also.
Yeah.
But, you know, but there was a lot of groove on that album. They always had that, and there was more of it on the second album than there was on the first. But this one had the groove. And in talking to them, I was trying to figure out, like, where did the groove of that band come from, the way that they incorporate it into their sound. And they said, look, you know, and it was similar to myself. Like, we liked music, and when we would hang out in the alleyway when we were teenagers or whatever, you know, we would have a boombox, and like 1 second we could be playing Negative Approach, and the next minute we could have been playing Boogie Down Productions. You know, hence the KRS-One, you know, trying to get him on the first album.
Yeah.
You know, they're like, we were fans, you know, and so we were like, how could we put that groove into our hardcore, you know? But still have it be like crushing and heavy, and, you know, and transition into something fast even, or whatever. And so, you know, the groove comes from New York, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like,
yeah.
you know, you hear a lot of these purist kids like, oh, fucking hip hop and hardcore, I hate that. And it's like, well, you probably aren't from New York, because you can't ignore it. Like, if you were a kid in the 80s in New York and you liked underground music, the stuff just came together. I mean, if you look at the history of, you know, hip hop and punk together with Blondie, with Rapture, and, you know, Fab Five Freddy going downtown and Blondie going uptown, and, you know, all that kind of stuff. I mean, it was inevitable, you know, that stuff would come together somehow. And there's some people that did it in a really silly, you know, like it was more about the fashion and the clothes and
Right.
the attitude. And there was some people who made great music with it, you know. And I'm not talking about rap rock, you know.
But like you would say, a legitimate form of music, like hardcore, Sick of It All specifically.
Madball incorporates hip hop into it, but you wouldn't necessarily know it, you know.
Yeah, there's just a feel. Like
it's
groove.
a feel, and it's an attitude.
Yep.
And you know, so if you were in the middle of the country, you may think that this is real weird, you know. But if you were from here, or, you know, the general vicinity of New York, you understood it, because when you went to the shows, you felt that attitude, you know, of New York, you know, street level New York, you know, hip hop, underground hardcore, you know, various other forms of music, you know, it all came together. And so it came together in hardcore too. And again, there were some people that did some dumb shit with it, but there are plenty of people who made it work for them. And I think Sick of It All was one of those bands, because it's so, you know, undercover in a way. Like, they're not forcing it at you at all.
No, they like flawlessly transition from like a thrashy part into
Right.
like a breakdown.
That's
with
right.
Like a hip hop part. You know.
That's
or
right.
like
Consume is like that
that's
whole
why I brought that.
song is, you know,
Yeah.
is that feel, you know.
And there's a lot of that. The beginning is the intros to a lot of the songs have this sound like
A lot of bass on that
bass.
album.
Yeah, a lot of.
It's
bass
a lot of
on that
Craig, you know.
Yep.
And Craig's a guy who was not a hip hop guy, you know, but he was definitely like a groove guy, and you know, obviously as a bass player, which he's always been, you know, it's just natural. But there's a good few songs on Scratch the Surface that start with bass.
Oh, a lot of
bass
yeah.
stuff.
That's like some of the like I said, that's what to me differentiates
The
that
album
record.
starts. No, the album starts with a hi-hat.
Yeah.
It starts with a hi-hat on No Cure, but I think the second song starts with bass. Consume starts with bass. You know.
You know, and something I always thought was interesting too is you know, you were mentioning that they got along really well with Napalm Death, and Napalm Death, at some point in their career, there's some like hip hop breakdowny type of parts of their grind, death grind stuff too. You know?
Well, they were very influenced by New York anyway.
Yeah.
Like they, you know, they ultimately, I mean, again, they called it grindcore over in the UK.
Yeah.
Like here, you know, they were like metallic crust punks in a way. Like it was, you know, a different thing. And so when they first started coming over, you know, and they would be in New York or a place like this, and they would meet bands here and things like that, Sick of It All being one of them, you know, it rubbed off on them a little bit, you know, because they went from being just ultra fast, crazy, like, you know, super speed stuff. And then suddenly they started to like get slower and heavier, you know, and they always had like some of the crazy thrash stuff going on, but, you know, they definitely started to incorporate some different flavors, and, you know, and it was definitely a New York thing that they threw in there a little bit.
Yeah, the drumming on some of their later, like mid to later records, I was just
when
like,
Mick wasn't the drummer anymore.
Exactly, there
know.
was like some of this like behind the beat stuff
Yes.
going on, which I was like, yeah, this is like definitely.
Yeah, and then they went on tour with Sick of It All and watched them play like 30 times in a row.
Yeah.
You know, and so it was after that, and yeah, so it's interesting like how that stuff works, you know, and the way that these vibes and these sounds like transfer, to different regions, and, the sound of a region of the country, like that there was a New York hardcore sound, and there was that grindcore, that British grindcore sound. And then you had the Venice sound, and you had the Huntington Beach sound, and the Hollywood sound, and all that stuff. And, then you have a Detroit sound. And, people don't talk about that enough because, while we were talking about the influence of the Bad Brains, not enough people talk about the influence of Negative Approach because, listen to AF.
Yeah, definitely.
Yep. And then, it was either Lou or Pete who said to me that, like, when they first heard, Negative Approach, like shortly after hearing Motorhead for the first time, when they were like, Jesus Christ, like that changed them again, and that had a big part in the shaping of the sound in New York.
Well, yeah, Breakdown covers Negative Approach, Ready to Fight.
Yeah.
It's like definitely...
Well, look at the song titles on AF and Madball Records, right? It's like, they're straight from it. But in a good way. But I love that sound, that very primal, floor tom, hardcore.
John Brannon's vocals.
Oh, his vocals and just, his stage presence. Like, you're terrified when you saw him.
I just saw him play late last year. This band I play in, we were on a festival with Negative Approach.
With Tombs.
With Tombs, yeah. And it was in Pontiac, Michigan. So it was kind of like a hometown
kind of hometown,
crowd.
yeah.
And it was like, I mean, it's not the original. None of the. I don't know. It's John Brannon and some of the guys.
Kind of all that matters, but yeah.
Yeah, it's Easy Action guys. And,
right.
Which is another great band too.
Yeah, I like them too.
But I've seen Negative Approach twice, like in the more recent years, and it's still sick, man. It's
Murder.
Still so good.
Like, so good, and they're still exactly what you want from them.
Totally.
Yeah. Like, if you want a dose of Negative Approach, like, definitely go. You're gonna get it.
Yeah.
But it's another band that was a big piece of all the sound of all this stuff we're talking about.
So you were hinting at you have a new book coming out? Because you've been doing a lot of writing in the last few years.
Yeah, one of the great authors of our time, right? I have 3 books coming out in 2019.
Three books in 2019.
Yeah. So one is coming out in May. It's a second edition of a book I did last year called Hip Hop Alphabet.
Okay.
That I do with my friend Caves from Lords of Brooklyn, who's a graffiti writer. And so he does the illustrations and I do the rhymes. And it's basically 26 pages of, like, your favorite, rap artists and, like, elements of the culture, breaking and DJing and all that kind of stuff, with, like, a graffiti illustration and a rhyme about that artist or that art form. And so we did a first one and it sold out everywhere. We had a lot of success with it, called Hip Hop Alphabet. And now we're doing Hip Hop Alphabet 2 that comes out in May. It's like you could already pre-sale. It's already up for pre-sale on Amazon. So we're doing that. And then there's going to be a paperback of the HR book, Finding Joseph I. So we did a new chapter, which picks up from where his health stuff left off. So this covers his recovery from brain surgery and also the reforming with the band and playing those shows last year or 2 years ago with Bad Brains, and just sort of the, like, what's going on with him. And just the chapter is fascinating because so much has happened to him in the last few years. It's so fast moving that it's really worth, like, getting the new information. So that's coming out probably in the early summer. And then we have a new forward for that from Randy Blythe.
Oh, wow.
So if when they did the Bad Brains shows, HR came out, did like the first 20, 25 minutes, and then Randy Blythe would come out and do all the fast hardcore stuff that HR was having trouble with. And so he's kind of almost a member, And he's also a super fan. He's a Bad Brains super fan. So he wrote us a great forward.
Oh, wow.
And so the paperback version is going to come out. And then now, about month, 6 weeks ago, we began work on the Pete and Lou book.
Oh, no way.
Yeah. So there's, which is why I thought you wanted to talk to me, actually.
No, let's talk about it.
It's perfect.
Sure.
So we, I
just didn't know about that.
Yeah, I started to do, I'm basically a writer. I do books now. Like, that's kind of what I'm doing. And so, I was looking for what the next sort of hardcore related book was. So I did the HR book, but I also brought in the Roger Moret book to the publisher to do, so I was a part of that. I was an associate editor on that book and all that stuff. So I'm like, really, like, the natural next one for me would be Sick of It All Guys, but I'm not particularly a big fan of books about bands because I just think I think a lot of that information is there. You know, I think you could find that stuff on the internet, generally speaking. You know, if you read enough interviews and look at all that. But I think when a band's like been meaningful for a long enough time, I think people want to know who those guys are, you know? And so I thought a cool idea would be to do something on Pete and Lou, 33 years already and Sick of It All, and also they're blood brothers, you know, and they did this entire thing together as brothers, and where every decision they've had to make, everything that they've had to consider and do in this band affected their actual brother, you know? And so I'm sort of doing it from that point of view. And it's going to be mostly them doing the talking, but we're going to throw in a couple of other voices here and there. So like I said, I interviewed Gary Holt for the book. Right. And I'm talking to Kurt from DRI, Barney from Napalm Death. I'm going to talk to Mark from MAD Booking, who brought them to Europe for the first time. Armand, Craig, obviously, Richie, you know. We'll talk to, you know, I want to talk to their parents. I'm going to talk to their brothers that got them into music.
Wow. Okay.
You know, so we're going to really try to, like, what made these guys tick.
That's like a really interesting take on it, because, like, I read the band books, you know, but I always find...
I like reading them, but I feel like some of them, if they're not really well done, I feel like I know all the shit already, you know?
But, like, but a lot of times I'll read these, like, books, and it's like, you know, I feel like I just got this kind of Cliff Notes version of it.
Right.
Without actually getting to know the people. And I think something like this, where you really dig down deep and you get the family involved.
Well, did you read Roger's book?
I did, yeah.
I mean, it's about him, you know? And the AF story gets told, as will the Sick of It All story in this book. But it's about this guy who was this, you know, came here from Cuba when he was 4 years old, and abusive family stuff, and like found the punk hardcore scene, and then became this leader, you know, and he's a very interesting guy with a lot to say, and he's been through a lot, you know, and that to me was infinitely more fascinating than reading a book about Agnostic Front the band.
Oh, totally.
You know?
I had to read that book. I interviewed Roger maybe 2 years ago, I think.
Yeah.
Or when the book came out.
When the book came out, probably, yeah.
And I got the PDF of the book like the day before I was supposed to interview him.
Right.
So I like speed read the whole thing.
It's hard, yeah. There's a lot in there.
I have since gone back and reread it, though.
Yeah.
And the same thing with Harley Flanagan's book, and his book was like 500 pages long.
His book's insane.
And the same thing. I found out I was going to interview him the next day.
Right.
At like 9 o'clock in the morning. They sent me a PDF.
Well, we'll try to get you this one earlier.
I would appreciate that one, man. That'd be great. You know, when's the potential release date for that one?
So that'll be probably November this year. The book is called The Blood and the Sweat.
Nice.
And it's The Blood and the Sweat, the story of Sick of It All's Koller brothers. And so, you know, again, Armand and Craig will be a big part of it, telling, you know, stories and things of that nature, and you know, talking about and complimenting things that went on over the course of the band. But, you know, I find those two guys and the way they operate, being the guitar player and the singer of a hardcore band, like, I want to know who those guys are, you know? Yeah. And if I was simply a fan and didn't have access to do this book, I'd want to read that book, you know?
Yeah, totally.
And so I think that's going to be an interesting read for a lot of people. And, you know, we're trying to go as deep as we can. And, you know, I've interviewed them already 8 times in the last like 5-6 weeks. So they're on the road now. So I'm trying to make it start to look like a book. But there's a lot of work to do. So I think I'll be working through May on this book. Nice. And then, you know, we'll get an editor to take a look at it and do all that stuff. But hopefully we could have it out for like October, November.
Well, maybe we can do another interview, another piece together. Maybe get Lou out here or something like that.
Yeah.
You know, to help promote the book. You know, that's a great I wasn't even aware of that, actually.
Yeah, I was like, well, the timing, he's got to know it's coming out, because like Blabbermouth ran something about it.
Yeah, no, I find out everything second, third wave, man.
Yeah, right. But it's it's all like this all just got underway, so it's pretty new.
Okay.
But we're working on it. It's great because like I know those guys from before they were a band. I used to go to their rehearsals and and then. The interviews that I'm doing with them are just, it feels like three guys, in a bar, like having a chat, it's like, that's kind of how this is going, because I'm reminding them of stuff they don't remember, and then like Pete will remember something that Lou doesn't remember, or vice versa. And like, it's just these conversations, and it's like, remember that show? And it's like, all three of us naturally were at that same show, so we can talk about it, from a very educated point of view. And I'd be like, do you remember when that happened? And like, no, I didn't know that happened. And I'd be like, I was like, you weren't there for that, and it's been a really fun process so far, because they're willing to talk, and we're pulling stuff out of each other,
Yeah, that's definitely, I want to revisit that when it gets closer to the release date.
Yeah.
Maybe schedule something around that.
That'd be great.
Fascinating, I think. But yeah, are you still doing anything at all with like the industry side of music, or?
I mean, the only thing I do is I manage one band. I manage a band called King's Bounty, which has Q Unique, who used to be in The Arsonist, on vocals, and Mike DeJean on guitar. And Lou Medina plays drums. There's a guitar player and a bass player that are younger guys in the band that Mike was friendly with. And, so those guys I've been working with for a bit now. Really great band. Another just doesn't fit the mold kind of thing. They're just doing what they do. They're just like, like a metallic hard rock band, very melodic. They have a single coming out next month through the Orchard called Denial, and then there's going to be an EP in probably April.
Oh, cool.
But they've been, gigging around, and they've just recorded there's a full album done, but we just don't think it's like time to put out like 12 songs, Yeah. But they've toured with Korn already.
Oh, okay.
They toured with POD. They played with Nuclear Assault at St. Vitus. They played with La Coca Nostra at SOBs, so they've done all these different types of shows. And they appeal to all. So it's not rap rock, it's more like very groovy. It's almost like, sort of a Soundgarden, Alice in Chains meets metal, more metal than that, but it's songy and it's heavy. And they're really, really good.
Have you heard Kenny Hickey's newer band?
It's Silver Tomb.
Silver Tomb.
Yeah, I heard them because they played with Life of Agony.
Yeah, right. That tour, yep.
And so it's interesting that there's all these bands, like these sort of just hard, heavy rock bands kind of coming out.
Yeah.
And so I think there's an audience for it, but it's just a different time for music. You know what I mean? The way you got to build a band and, sort of become a brand in a way and do all that stuff. It's very, very different. The internet is a blessing and a curse, because it's allowing everybody to make music. But the problem is that most shouldn't be.
And I was just going to say that it's allowing everyone to make music, and everyone is making music.
And there's a lot of shitty music. So there's a lot to weed through, right?
Yeah.
Like the funny thing is, like, here we're sitting here, you wouldn't know it, but we're sitting here with my 10-year-old daughter, right? Who likes music a lot, but she certainly, by the time, I was her age, I'd seen Kiss already. You know what I mean? And so what I realized with my daughter is that she likes a lot of songs, but she hasn't really latched on to that many artists yet,
Yeah.
Where I think when we were younger, you kind of latched on to an artist, you ripped open Kiss Alive and you stared at, the gatefold, and you read all the credits, and you're looking at the cover while you're listening. And it's this experience, this all immersive, kind of thing. And I just don't know if a lot of kids are getting that right now. And I think metal's a little different, because I think that tradition is still there a lot, but even with hardcore, I don't see it as much, because I think people are buying records digitally, and you just don't have that like 12-inch cover to like stare at and like get the emotional side added to the music, It's very, very different, and it's harder to penetrate,
It's sad.
A fan.
It's sad because I have Apple Music too, and like, you know, I find out about tons of shit that way. You know, new band. I'm like, I won't even hesitate if someone's like, "Oh, check out this band." I'm like, all right, cool, look them up.
I want to hear new music.
Yeah, I want to hear it, but I always like, you know, I still want the big format. You know, I want to be able to look at the artworok, and it's like the way.
And I'm not a big vinyl guy.
I am a vinyl.
My
guy,
desire for music has not turned me into a vinyl guy. You know, because I think for me it's a matter of time. I just don't have time, you know, to really collect and like, you know, dig in crates and do all that stuff. But I'll still get the album and I'll still listen to it one way or another. But I need like the ease of it. So I'm like that asshole that's ruined this whole thing because I need digital to keep up. But, you know, I love that vinyl's made a bit of a comeback, and I love that, you know, at least there's a chance for, you know, that tactile, like I can hold this record and listen to it, and, you know, that's still a possibility, you know, because it seemed for a while there that was gone.
Yeah, that was like pretty, for a while there was like some dark days where it looked like it was over, you know.
It looked like it was over.
You know? But like also for me personally, it's like I usually buy either a mail order the vinyl or I'll buy it at a show if I see a band, and I feel like at the show I'm paying into the band's economy.
That's right, I mean? And it's important.
Yeah,
because especially now, like especially ever, I guess it's like if it's sort of underground for all intents and purposes, that band is slogging it out on the road. They got to like figure out a way to pay for everything.
Absolutely.
And, you know, and it's the same thing with tickets. Like I've worked with bands for, you know, God knows how many years and whatever. I'm still paying almost all the time.
Yeah.
Because
totally.
I know that money helps them, and it's important. And that's why, you know, even when I was into things like Napster and whatever, I'd still buy something I loved because you knew that's important, you know? And
well, you know Paul Delaney, right?
Sure.
Yeah. So Black Anvil, good friends of mine.
Love them.
I've never asked them to put on the guest list for any of their shows because I want to support them.
You just want to show up like a fan, and
you know, and you know, we've toured together, we've gone to Europe together, and done all these things, but I never asked to be on the guest list.
Yeah, I try very hard to just buy the tickets. Like, you know, Madball's playing in Queens this weekend, and I'm just buying a ticket.
Where are they playing in Queens?
They're playing Blackthorn 51.
Oh, right, yeah. I know that place.
Which I have a love-hate relationship with that place because they do some pay-to-play. But
so now, is that... damn, what the hell? I can't believe it's escaping me. There was that other venue that was there out in Elmhurst forever.
Oh, Lemoore East?
Nope, no. It was right off of Northern Boulevard.
Because Lemoore East is like a block away from where this place is.
Oh, really?
Where it was, obviously, years ago. What else was in Queens near
I saw
that
like
area?
Marauder play there.
And Castle Heights.
Castle Heights.
Yeah.
All right. So Blackthorn, I haven't been out there yet.
It's the guy, one of the guys was involved in Castle Heights.
Okay, yeah.
So he brings the bands in, but then it's Nicky Camp, who used to do like the Limelight and all that stuff. But then there's someone else there who was involved in Castle Heights who helps book the bands and, you know, knows who to bring there, you know. So they've been doing a bunch of hardcore shows and stuff. Like AF's played there, Harley played there, Murphy's Law's played there, Dog Eat Dog played there, Leeway's played there. So, you know, they're trying to bring in all the good stuff. But yeah, so, you know, you got to support these bands, man. Like, they don't just... I'll never forget, like, you know, when we did that In Effect home video, right? And Jimmy Gestapo was talking, and he's like, we don't pull up to the gas station. They're like, oh, you're a hardcore band with something to say. Here's some free gas. Like, you know, it doesn't work that way. Like, you know, every quarter counts, you know?
Yeah. And that was even back when gas wasn't like $3.50 a gallon or whatever the hell it was now. Now it's like...
Still cheaper than it was a few years ago, which is so crazy.
There was that one summer where gas, I remember fuel was like over
$5, right?
In some parts of the country, it was $5 a gallon.
That's right.
And I was like, man.
California was higher than out here.
Yeah.
Because it's the car culture. But, you know, but we don't price gouge, but, you know.
Yeah. But I just was remembering when I saw those prices on fuel going up, I was like, man, how the hell are we going to like stay on the road in the summertime, man? It was like...
Well, there's that. And then, I mean, listen, don't get me started. We're in a government shutdown, you know? Dude. And it's like, you know, and you have all that going on. And it's like every day I just get like more and more upset about it because these people are just getting crushed, you know? And it's like, price of gas is just one thing on that list, you know?
Oh, yeah.
It's like feeding children and keeping homes and, you know, it's all that stuff. And that stuff drives me nuts. And I think that's another reason why I feel still connected to hardcore and punk, because like at least there's artists who are going to talk about that stuff, you know?
Yeah,
It's
definitely.
like metal bands are not going to talk about it.
Talk about, like, you know,
I don't want to generalize, but they're probably not. Right, you know? And it's like, you know, it's just rough. And it's like, but for these bands to be able to survive and be out there and do this stuff, you know, you have to really support them. And it's like, you can't do the like, oh, well, they'll come through town again. It's like, maybe not.
Maybe not.
Maybe they won't.
That's exactly it. You know, like there was, that's happened to me on a couple of occasions where a band, I'm like, oh, I'll see them next time they come through, and they just broke up or something.
Right,
like
or whatever, you know?
Them, you know?
And then you're like, is it because I didn't pay? You know, like, is it my fault?
Yeah, you start
getting guilty,
getting those guilt trips put on you, you know.
You know.
So these 3 books that are coming out, are they published in the same publisher that you've been working with?
So all 3 are. So the first Hip Hop Alphabet was through another publisher, but this new publisher, which is called Permuted Press, which is part of another company called Post Hill Press, which is distributed by Simon & Schuster, actually. So, you know, I just signed to East West, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
And so they picked up the first Hip Hop Alphabet.
Awesome.
So they're going to reissue that, do the new one, and then they got the rights to the HR book as well. So we're doing the paperback with them, and then we're doing the Pete and Lou book through them as well. So, you know, they've done a lot of music titles, but they've got all kinds of weird, you know, all kinds of different stuff. Like, what did they do? Oh, they did like some weird, like Trump coloring book.
Yeah,
you know,
they have like some sort of like left of center stuff going on.
Yeah,
sure.
So they did a Trump coloring book. It sold like 100,000 copies or something like that. It's insane. So, you know, but they put out some fun books too, and you know the distribution will be good. And the editor that I worked with at the previous publisher went over there, so that's why I'm working with him there. And he knows this stuff. You know, he knows underground music. He respects it, and it's something that, you know, he did the AF book, the Roger book, you know, as well. And so, you know, he sees that there's value in this, and that if we treat it right, we could do pretty well with these books and, you know, get an interesting story out there from, I think, someone most other publishers wouldn't really touch.
What about the radio show?
So I've been doing the radio show for about 2.5 years with Ill Bill called Merciless. We have been on Bushwick Radio for the last, you know, year or so. And I guess I don't want to give away too much, but we're moving stations.
Okay.
Let's just say there's going to be a brand new station in the East Village coming soon that I am involved with Jesse Mallon, ex-Degeneration, you know, ex-Heart Attack, all that stuff. You know, he has 4 venues downtown.
Yeah.
And so we are going to be launching an online radio station out of Coney Island, baby.
Nice.
So we're working on that. I have another meeting with them next week. We've been talking about it for months, so this is not a new thing, but they have to build out the space. I think there's going to be a recording studio down there too, because they want to do something there. So we're going to move our show there too. A few other shows that you've heard before are going to be moving there with us. Cool. And then there's going to be a whole new curated batch of shows, like very New York centric. There'll be a reggae show. There'll be like a real punk show, garage stuff, you know. It'll be all over the place, but very like New York underground, interesting. And so that's coming pretty soon. Like, you know, I would say hopefully in the next month or 6 weeks, I think we might be launching that. So we don't have a name for it yet, but we're going to do it. And I love doing the show with Ill Bill. And, you know, he's been a friend again forever. And I love nonfiction and all of his stuff. And we share so much taste, and he's like a metal encyclopedia and loves hardcore as well, but he's really like the metal encyclopedia. Like you could ask him anything and he'll just remember shit that you're like, I don't know how you remember that, and so our conversations on the air are always funny. We like hate a lot of the same stuff, and we like to make fun of stuff, and that's one of the beauties of our show is we don't accept submissions from labels or publicists or radio people. So we play whatever we want. And if we want to shit on something, we can. If we want to praise it, we can. If we want to, talk about how they used to suck and now they're great, or vice versa, we can. And we have no fear of people who don't want to service us records anymore.
Nice.
We could say whatever we want. And, Megadeth is often a victim of our ire. Well, when we were on East Village Radio, when we started, the only time we ever got a cease and desist letter, pardon me, see, it's choking me up, was from Megadeth, because we would put the radio show up on SoundCloud after we would do it, and they didn't like that we were streaming the brand new Megadeth song for free. Like, how many radio shows do you think play Megadeth?
Probably very little at this stage.
Very few.
Yeah.
And so you want to shit on your fans like that, which I'm not really a fan, but like we felt we should play the new Megadeth. It was almost like we played it like a smash or trash kind of thing. Like,
okay.
We'll play the new Megadeth, and Bill and I would swear we won't listen to it before we play it on the show, and then we would say what we thought about it, and we happened to like that song too, which was a weird thing. We were a little surprised that we liked it. It was very like Peace Cells era sounding,
See, that's the last time I liked Megadeth, really.
Right. But this that last album, or it's probably 2 albums ago already, we were like, oh, the song's like pretty good. It has that feel to it, And then like we get a cease and desist from Universal, like you can't like stream Megadeth for free. We're like, all right, you guys go fuck yourselves. And they pull the show down from SoundCloud, man. It just disappears.
Nah, that's no good.
So we're just like, all right, whatever. So Megadeth's on our shit list. So that's a band we won't play ever again.
But I like the sound of this show because it reminds me of college radio when I was growing up.
Well, that's the thing. We want it to be college radio. We want to have like we're living our little college radio fantasy, like, because we never did it in college, like, because we didn't really deal with college much. So, we're doing it now. And we just feel that like hip hop is worse with this stuff, but I feel like a lot of young kids with like underground music, like punk and metal and hardcore especially, they don't have a ton of respect for the elders. You know what I mean? And so they don't show, they don't give the like original bands their due the way that they should, and you don't have to love like every Iron Maiden record or whatever,
right.
But like to sort of not acknowledge them in the proper way is just disrespectful.
I agree with that, especially since a band like that's given so much to like the style,
and still are,
Still are, yeah.
And it's like, so our show is a mix of that sort of classic. We call it classic and new classic. So you have like your Maidens, but then we'll play Siege, and it's like, and we've played Tombs before. And,
really?
Oh, sure.
Oh, cool.
And
that's great.
We'll play, Primitive Weapons, and we'll play, we play plenty of Black Anvil, and so that's as new as we get. Like we don't have to be the cool kids on the block playing every obscure new band, but there's stuff that we like, and I heard Tombs. I've seen you guys too. So
oh really?
Yeah, I saw you guys at Vitus, and
cool.
So it's like was a discovery for me. Like I'd been seeing, this band Tombs is playing around, and they played with these bands who I like, so I wound up checking out your band,
nice. Appreciate that.
So then we'd always give at least a play to something we like, because it's so rare that we really like something new,
Yeah.
And so it's tough. So we'll try, to give some newer bands a shot. Like there's a couple of newer hardcore bands we liked. Also, like Outlive Death from Long Island. Do you know those guys?
I don't know them.
Those guys are really good.
I know Incendiary.
Yeah, this is like newer than that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Outlive Death, and there's Ache, Ryan,
okay,
his band, and we'll play stuff like that just because it's like, thank God these bands do what they do. Like they're keeping like a tradition of like a certain kind of hardcore, that people don't do anymore, where they, it's gotten very metallic, or, you know, everybody wants to sound like Turnstile, or everybody's trying to go in the Code Orange direction, and, you know, and
7-string guitars.
Yeah, and it's just like, and it's all cool. I love
Yeah.
Turnstile. I think they're great,
Yeah.
you know, but ultimately this, you know, I talked to Freddie Madball about this because they booked the Black and Blue Bowl. And one of the issues that they have in booking it is this scene moves so fast, right?
True. That's
where
very
like in 2019, Terror's like a fucking old band, you know?
Yeah.
Which is bizarre.
Yeah.
You know? But that's how fast the shit moves. That like, it's not crazy that in 2 years nobody gives a shit about Turnstile, you know? And I don't know if that'll be the case or not, but you have to consider it, you know, because there's a difference between being 15 and 18.
Yeah,
you
those
know?
3 years are huge
It's
years.
a big deal.
Yeah.
And so it moves really fast. And, you know, so, and sick of it all, we were talking about this too with Pete and Lou, that they're like, you know, to keep alive as a hardcore band, you know, you have to replenish the new kids. Like
You always got to have new fans.
And so they're like, that's our challenge, you know, because we know like there's a few hundred older heads that'll always come see us and whatever, but we have to be smart about who we play with or who comes with us on tour, because we want those younger kids. Like, we need to turn them on, you know, in the sort of like, this is how it's done, kids. Like, not to be arrogant about it, but just sort of like, yeah, we're still probably better than the band you came to see, you know, that kind of stuff. And you have to have that attitude. Like, you have to have that sort of, you know, be a little pompous and be like, you know what, still we're living in a fuck you world, and we're going to try to blow your band away.
Well, yeah, that's all.
know?
That's some primate shit.
There's something
you know what I
cool
mean?
about
Yeah,
the competition.
definitely.
Like, I don't mind that
Competition's good. I've always felt that. Always that competitive edge, that sort of, you know, like I said, that primate vibe is like something you got to have.
Gary Holt was like, he goes, you know, when Sick of It All comes on tour with you, you play a little better that night.
Play a little better, that's for sure.
He's like, our shows during that run were pretty good. They're like, because we were like, we got to top that energy, and that's going to be hard, you know? And so, you know, I like that vibe. Like, that's cool. Like, some people like, oh, the hardcore scene is so cool because it's not competitive. Yeah, it is.
It's real competitive. I think everything that has to do with like aggressive music is a competitive scene.
You don't think every band wants to blow the other band away?
Dude, we talk about it in the van all the time, man.
It's like, I want bands to want to blow each other away.
And I want people to try to blow me away too.
That's
man.
right, because it's
better.
like, that's right. And it's going to make the show better for kids in the audience. It's like, I keep saying kids, like I'm fucking 80. I just turned 51 on Sunday.
I'm right behind you, bro.
Yeah. I was like, I figured we were about the same age.
Yeah, we're about the same age. Yeah.
Did anybody ever tell you that you look like MC Search?
Really?
Do you ever get that?
No one's ever told me that.
As soon as I came in.
Wow, all right.
And I've seen you on stage, but it's different, you know?
It's different in real life.
But being in the room, like being 5 feet away from you, I'm like, he looks a lot like MC Search.
That's a compliment, man.
Yeah, and because you look like him now. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So not so much when you had like the flat top,
That's pretty cool, though,
fade
still,
deal,
man.
but you look a little like MC Search.
Yeah, no one said that to me, but I'll take that for sure.
Pop goes the weasel.
Well, on that note, thanks a lot for coming out.
It's cool, Search.
Appreciate it. That's it. You're going to call me Search for now on.
But yeah, and his name is Michael.
You know, maybe
his real name is Michael.
Maybe you know how everyone has a double.
I've never seen you in the same place together.
Hey man, that's the
you
mystery.
might be MC Search.
It's the mystery now, man. And thanks for listening, everyone. And I'll see you next week. You've been listening to Metal Matters, a Gimme Radio podcast. We'll be back next week, so be sure to subscribe and never miss out. Also, be sure to check out Gimme Radio via web, iOS, or Android for one of the best metal communities in the world, exclusive interviews and merch, and so much more.
Thursday's going to be 50 degrees.
Yes, that's global warming, man.
No shit.
I had to go to meet my my accountant, like stop by his house to pick up some paperwork yesterday, and I humped it out there to it's like First Avenue and 38th Street, and the dude wasn't there.
Oh God!
And I was coming all the way in.
And you just, but standing there even for 1 minute is too much.
Yeah, I came all the way out from like Coney Island basically, because I was working at home because it was too cold to leave.
Right. You don't even leave the house.
And then, so yeah, it was pretty brutal. And then all the way out there for nothing. 2.5 hours of my day just shot.
And
then
and he never showed up.
No, well, he was like, I was in the building. They had an intercom. It's like you could have him page me. I go, how am I supposed to know these?
You're supposed to just know that.
Yeah. And then so that I couldn't get warm. I came home, and then I was like cold for like 3 hours. You know what I mean? I just couldn't warm up.
Horrible.
Yeah. But I stopped by today. He was in the city, today, and I got my stuff from him. So it's all good.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, at least you got it done.